Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin, and today I'd like to talk about a subgenre of science fiction that I think is particularly imaginative and wondrous and immersive, and that's space opera. I'm talking about tales of adventure in outer space and on distant planets. And some of my favourite novels fit within this category. And common tropes that you might encounter in these stories include things like futuristic spacecraft, colourful characters, space warfare, galactic empires, extraterrestrial beings, and many more things besides. So there's a lot of potential here for really immersive and compelling storytelling and world building within space opera. And often these stories take place on a really vast and epic scale. And the world building is so sophisticated that these books typically form part of a bigger series with sequels and prequels and spin-offs, things like that. So I put together this list of 10 space opera novels. And the first 5 of these are books that I've read and I can wholeheartedly recommend. And the second 5 are books that I haven't read yet, but they're in my TBR and I've heard some very good things about them and I'm very much looking forward to reading them. So let's get stuck in. And the first thing that I'd like to recommend is A Fire Upon the Deep by Vernor Vinge. So this is a really interesting novel. It's full of some really amazing world building and ideas. And there's some really fascinating alien species as well. So most memorably, I think, for me is the Tines, which are a race of wolf-like sentient beings that live together in small packs. And these packs act like hive minds. It's really intriguing. And the universe that this world is set in is also very intriguing and complex. They've got this idea called the zones of thought, in which the galaxy is divided into concentric regions of space, and within each region there are different standards of physics that apply. And this determines limits within each zone, limits on technology, limits on the development of biological and artificial intelligence. So some very deep and complex world building, fascinating novel. There is a sequel out there and a prequel, which I haven't read, but I do highly recommend A Fire Upon the Deep for a deep and compelling and thought-provoking space opera. Next up, Revelation Space by Alistair Reynolds. So this was the first Alistair Reynolds book that I read, and it's also the first of his books to be published. It's a hard SF space opera set several hundred years in the future, with plenty of compelling ideas and interesting characters and some deep and engaging world building. It is a bit of a slow burn at times, but there is a really great payoff and a very memorable ending. And this book is just the start of the whole Revelation Space sequence, which is one of my favourite book series that I've read. So we've got a few direct sequels, but there are also prequels and other books set within that universe. This is the logical place to start, though. So I do recommend you give it a try. And then we have this book, The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. And this book is the first book in the Wayfarers Quartet of novels. And this is a character-focused space opera with strong found family vibes. So you've got a multi-species cast of characters on board a spaceship, and it's the crew's role to punch wormholes in space. That's the ultimate goal. And there's some really great character building within this story. We've got a very interesting array of characters. It's very diverse. We've got human characters. We've got various different alien species. And we've also got an AI character to boot. So you can't fault the character building. And this book also has a kind of feel-good feeling to it. The plot structure, it kind of feels like a road trip in space. And some readers might not get on with it that much because there's not really much dramatic tension going on, especially for a subgenre that is often characterized by adventure and conflict. There isn't really much conflict within the story, but I still found it very entertaining and a pleasure to read. And the next book, on the other hand, is absolutely characterized by dramatic conflict. And that is Fearless by Alan Stroud. The first part of a trilogy called the Fractal series. And I honestly don't think this series gets enough attention. I recently interviewed the author on his channel, so feel free to check that out if you'd like to know more. But anyway, this book is a hard SF space opera. It's set in the 22nd century, and it is quite realistic in its detail, in its physics and in its science. But it's also very intense and thrilling. So we've got a narrative in which a ship picks up a distress signal in outer space, goes to investigate, and finds a mysterious abandoned freighter out in space. And then something very dramatic happens. I won't tell you what. And then things get increasingly tense and relentless from there. It's written in a very intense and thrilling way. We've got first-person present narration with a rotating cast of POV characters. It almost feels like the literary equivalent of watching 24. It's that intense. I recommend you check it out. And then we have Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I read this book last year. It's one of the best things I've read in recent times. This has got just so much going for it. A lot of really interesting ideas, things that I really enjoy reading about in science fiction, things like generation ships, terraformed planets, species uplift, things like that, with a really epic and mind-blowing story. And of course, you've got sentient spiders. What's not to like? Now let's move on to some space operas in my TBR. Starting off with The Skylark of Space by E. Doc Smith. This is a very early example of space opera. Most of the books that I've been talking about on this list are modern, okay? They were published in the last 20 to 30 years, but this one was originally serialized in magazine form way back in the 1920s, before later being published as a novel. And it was followed by 3 sequels. I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that this is described as an action-packed space adventure, and I'm very curious to see what it's like. And then we have this book, Pandora's Star by Peter F. Hamilton. This is one book which I'm very excited to read. I've heard so many good things about it. I read Hamilton for the first time recently with his short fiction collection, Manhattan in Reverse. So I got a taste of what his writing's like, and I got a taste of this book and this series actually, because a couple of the stories within that collection are set within the same universe as this book, which, as you can see, is quite a chunky tome. It's part one of a duology called the Commonwealth Saga. So I'm very much looking forward to getting lost in this epic. And this is in my TBR for next year. And then we have Binti by Nedia Korafor. This is a novella, so it's very much on the opposite end of the chunkiness scale. In fact, it's very slim. Have a look at that. It's a coming-of-age story. It's about a girl who has to leave her home and her people in order to study across the galaxy, but then disaster befalls her ship. That's the basic premise. There are more novellas and short stories set within the series. Last year I enjoyed reading Lagoon, which is another novel by this author. It's about an alien invasion in Nigeria. But I think Binti has actually received more acclaim overall than that book, so I'm definitely curious to check it out. And the next space opera in my TBR is Light by M. John Harrison. And this book was recommended to me by a friend. I'm not really sure what it's about exactly, but I've heard it combines elements of space opera with things like noir fiction and magical realism and surreal fantasy. And it's part of a trilogy. This author is highly respected. I did in fact go to a talk with M. John Harrison last year, and I got him to sign this book. There it is. But I haven't actually read it yet. So I'm definitely looking forward to giving this a try soon. And finally, the last book that I'd like to mention is The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. And this is the debut novel of quite an up-and-coming young author. And unlike everything else I've mentioned today, it's a standalone. So from what I've heard of this book, the narrative spans multiple timelines over a huge period of time, and we've got quite an interesting cast of characters, including a boy with a special ability who holds the key to unlock the secrets to the universe. So it sounds like quite an intriguing concept, and everyone who I've heard talking about this book speaks of it very highly. So I think I'll enjoy this one. Those are all of the space opera books that I want to mention. Thank you for watching, and please let me know your thoughts. Have you read any of these? Which of my TBR books would you recommend? Are there any other space operas that you think I should read? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you soon.